Imagine standing on a windswept plateau over 10,000 feet in the air, roughly 2,500 years ago. Bitingly cold wind whips across black and white stone rings arranged around a freshly dug grave in the remote Pamir Mountains. Right in front of you sits a small wooden brazier. Inside it, several river pebbles just heated to a glowing red in a nearby fire are flickering in the dim light. Someone quietly steps forward and places dry, broken plant fragments directly onto the scorching stones. A thick, dense plume of pungent smoke immediately billows upward. You lean forward. The people standing around you do the same, drawing the heavy aromatic air deep into their lungs. There are no individual smoking pipes here, no rolling papers, no lighters. But the invisible chemicals trapped inside the charred residue of that wooden bowl will outlive every single human being standing by that grave. And 2,500 years later, that dark crust will reveal to modern science one of the oldest pieces of direct evidence of humans inhaling cannabis smoke. But was this really the very first time our ancestors experienced this altered state? Or is it simply the oldest surviving trace that time hasn't wiped away? Today, when you hear the phrase, smoking weed, your mind immediately jumps to familiar images of modern society, a joint of glass pipe smoke inhaled directly from an open flame, usually as an individual recreational habit in everyday life. But the discoveries unearthed at the Jirzankal burial site point to a completely different technology. Ancient humans didn't smoke the way we think they did. They dropped red-hot stones into wooden braziers, laid dried plants on top to bake them. And then the people attending the ritual inhaled the concentrated smoke together inside an enclosed space. So our story today isn't a hunt to find out who rolled the world's very first joint. It is an archaeological investigation to decode three much deeper questions. When did humans actually start using the cannabis plant? When did they realize it had the power to alter the mind? And exactly when? Is there solid proof that they intentionally burned it to inhale the smoke? Here we hit a fundamental problem. When the smoke vanished into the air millennia ago, how can an archaeologist look at a pile of ancient dirt and actually prove that prehistoric people got high? A single seed found in a grave isn't enough. A piece of fabric or a rope woven from hemp stalks is nowhere near enough. Even if you uncover a bundle of dried plants respectfully buried right next to a human skeleton, you still can't prove that anyone ever burned or inhaled the smoke of that plant. To definitively prove an altered state of consciousness, in the deep past, science requires a perfect convergence of multiple layers of evidence, appearing all at once. You have to correctly identify the plant species, find heat-scorched tools, extract psychoactive cannabinoid compounds from the charred residue, and prove that the surrounding context was a deliberate ritual, not just someone tossing random weeds into a campfire to keep warm. This challenge is way bigger than most people realize, because for most of human history, there was an enormous gap between using a plant and inhaling its smoke. For thousands of years, the cannabis plant wasn't seen as a mind-altering substance. It was a biological Swiss Army knife growing out of the dirt. Our ancestors harvested its seeds as a protein-rich food source and pressed them for oil. They stripped the incredibly durable fibers from its stalks to twist into rope weave, into fishing nets, and sew into everyday clothing. They also utilized various parts of the plant in traditional medical remedies. Because of this finding, cannabis at an archaeological site doesn't automatically mean people were altering their minds. The hardest part is that the most critical evidence for smoking is breathtakingly fragile. Leaves and flowers rot away quickly in the soil. Smoke doesn't fossilize. Wooden tools decay over time. The biggest question for scientists was never simply, was cannabis present, but always, what were they actually doing with it? And by tracing the tiny fragments left behind, researchers have pieced together a timeline of evidence stretching back thousands of years. Evidence number 1 reveals that humans befriended this plant long before we have any proof they smoked it. A massive genetic study recently sequenced the genomes of over 110 modern and traditional cannabis cultivars. The conclusion was striking. The cannabis sativa plant was first domesticated by humans in East Asia during the early Neolithic period, at least 12,000 years ago. But notice the massive time gap here. 12,000 years ago, humans were cultivating this plant for fiber and food. Meanwhile, the clearest direct chemical evidence of smoke inhalation only shows up around 2,500 years ago. That means humans were likely farming, managing, and harvesting this plant for nearly 10,000 years before they actually started burning it to shift their state of consciousness. It was a millennial relationship that slowly transformed a multi-purpose agricultural crop into a tool of the mind. Evidence number 2. The Yanghai tombs prove they knew the plant had pharmacology, but doesn't prove they smoked it. At the Yanghai site in the Turpan Basin of Xinjiang, dating back roughly 2,700 years, archaeologists uncovered an astonishing botanical treasure inside a man's grave, nearly 800 grams of perfectly preserved cannabis leaves and flowers stored inside a leather basket and a wooden bowl. When lab chemists analyzed it, they found clear traces of THC, the primary psychoactive compound, along with its degradation products. This man clearly didn't grow this stash for fiber because the leaves and flowers had been carefully sorted and selected. He kept them for their medicinal or ritual properties. And yet across that entire tomb, there wasn't a single heat-treated tool suggesting those dried flowers were ever burned. He might have eaten them, brewed them into a tea, used them as a painkiller, or used them in divination. We know Central Asians at that time understood the plant's neurological effects, but hard proof of smoke inhalation was still hiding. Evidence number 3. The Jiayi cemetery proves the plant had become a sacred symbol. Also in the Turpan Basin, inside a 2,800-year-old grave at the Jiayi site, scientists witnessed a deeply moving scene. 13 nearly intact female cannabis plants laid diagonally across a man's body, like a burial shroud covering him from his chest to his feet. By this point, the plant was no longer just an economic resource or a basic medicine. It held an elevated symbolic status, acting as a profound link between the living and the realm of the dead. But once again, scientific rigor steps in. Not a single one of those 13 plants draped over the skeleton showed any burn marks. A grave filled with sacred plants still isn't absolute proof of a room filled with smoke. That brings us to evidence number 4. The Jirzankal Cemetery in the Pamir Mountains, the literal smoking gun. High up at over 10,000 feet in the Pamir Mountain range, archaeologists excavated 8 tombs dating back roughly 2,500 years. Inside them, they discovered 10 small wooden braziers containing river stones that showed clear signs of high heat scorching. When researchers applied gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, an ultra-sensitive method used to analyze microscopic organic residues, the results sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. They found unmistakable chemical signatures of cannabinoids inside the charred crust on the wood and across the surfaces of the stones. Even more striking, the samples had an overwhelming concentration of CBN, a compound formed when psychoactive THC oxidizes and breaks down over time. This proved that 2,500 years ago, the people at Jirzankal weren't burning common wild hemp. They actively selected and heated plant strains with significantly higher levels of psychoactive THC, placed them on hot stones to generate a thick, powerful vapor, and inhaled it together. This is the most complete direct chemical evidence of intentional smoke inhalation ever discovered. And evidence number 5 shows that this wasn't an isolated random habit. It was part of a sprawling ritual network. Jirzankal didn't exist in a vacuum. Throughout the first millennium BCE, the tradition of burning herbs on hot stones during burials appeared scattered across Central Asia, from the Turpan Basin all the way to the Altai Mountains. Even the ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote about Scythian nomadic warriors setting up sealed felt tents after a funeral, tossing hemp seeds and plants onto red-hot stones to create a vapor that made them shout for joy. Plant smoke didn't travel as a casual recreational pastime. It rode on horseback along the Silk Road and across Central Asian trade routes as a spiritual technology embedded in funerary rites. But here, we hit a massive perspective shift that changes everything. The first cannabis smoker in human history probably wasn't doing it to unwind after a hard day of work or to party with friends. Our oldest, sharpest evidence doesn't come from a normal house, a marketplace, or a tavern. It comes from a freezing graveyard on a high mountain peak. That archaeological context tells us that this experience was directly linked to death grief and the transition between worlds. It wasn't a casual individual indulgence. It was a collective spiritual experience strictly controlled by ritual. So asking, when did humans start smoking weed to get high, turns out to be way too modern of a question. The better question is, when did humans start borrowing the smoke of an earthly plant to face death and connect with the unseen world of their ancestors? So how did our ancestors, thousands of years ago, figure out that this familiar plant had the power to alter human consciousness in the first place? Even though we don't have a prehistoric diary documenting that exact moment, behavioral science can reconstruct a very logical, evolutionary chain of events. It started with familiarity. Humans lived alongside this plant every single day, harvesting it to weave fabric and press oil. They were intimately familiar with its scent and the sticky resin that clung to their hands during harvest. Then fire acted as an accidental catalyst. During a cold winter, dried branches of the plant were likely tossed into a cave campfire or used as fuel to keep warm. People sitting around the flames accidentally inhaled the rising smoke. Noticeably, their heart rates shifted, their perception of time and space bent, and physical aches or nighttime anxieties suddenly faded away. But the difference between an accident and a cultural technology is replication. A community didn't just experience that accidental haze, they observed it, remembered it, and experimented. They realized that burning the leaves and flowers produced a much stronger effect than burning the fibrous stalks. They learned that the stones had to be scorching hot, and the space had to be enclosed, or the wind would just blow the smoke away. And over generations, they began actively seeking out, selecting, or harvesting mountain plant populations where intense UV radiation pressure naturally caused the plants to produce thicker THC-rich resin to protect themselves. The first inhalation might have been an accident of fire, but the 100th time, it had become a refined tradition. And that points to something profound about how humanity builds culture. A chemical molecule by itself carries zero moral or spiritual meaning. The exact same neurological effect on the human brain, depending on the era, could be viewed as a healing medicine, an astrological sign from the gods, a coming-of-age ritual, or an illegal substance banned by law. What makes the ancient people at Jirzankal so remarkable isn't just that they discovered the chemical reaction of the cannabis plant. What is extraordinary is how they wrapped that biological reaction in cultural meaning. They placed it at the most sacred, vulnerable moment of human existence, when a tribe member passes away. They used specialized tools in a communal setting to share a psychological state together. We don't just search out mind-altering substances. We are the only species on Earth that creates sacred narratives to explain why an altered state of consciousness actually matters to our lives. Today, in ultra-clean modern laboratories, a scientist takes a tiny cotton swab, scrapes the black residue from a 2,500-year-old wooden brazier, feeds it into a mass spectrometer, and watches chromatography peaks appear on a computer screen. That is the true magic of modern archaeology, the ability to peer through the thick fog of time and reconstruct experiences that seem completely invisible. Today, we categorize the cannabis plant through legal clauses, medical trials, inorganic chemistry, and 21st-century pop culture. But those ancient nomads standing on the Pamir peaks categorized it with a very different question. Is this a plant born to help the living? Walk just a little bit more gently closer to the people they have lost. We will never know the name of the first person who accidentally tossed a cannabis branch into a campfire. But we know one thing for certain. 2,500 years ago, amidst the freezing cold on the roof of the world, a group of ancient humans learned how to take the rising smoke of an earthly plant and turn it into a sacred bridge connecting the world of the living with the realm of spirits.